Hello dear viewers, thank you very much for tuning in. I would like to welcome you to an interview which, due to its explosiveness, must be conducted completely unrecognized and outside the usual areas of defined channel and identification boundaries. Out of competition, so to speak. An interview that will deal with old familiar questions about the intangible things of our universe. But above all about the influence on people from outside and inside. In other words, about the control of this planet and our consciousness. These are actually well-known questions, but our guest will come up with completely different answers, unusually different answers. Basically, this seems to be nothing new at first. If you look at television, the internet, books, Hollywood movies, or all the reports about secret machinations, about aliens, UFOs, secret societies and dark forces, which are nowadays being thrown around our ears in all media from shady to well-founded. We are constantly being supplied and bombarded with information that has subtly created something in our collective subconscious, which for example proves the reality of visitors to foreign planets, keeps religious myths alive, explains and mystifies extrasensory phenomena, believes time travel is possible or shows us the future feasibility of spaceships at the speed of light. Subliminally, according to our guest, all of this is slowly and creepingly planted into our consciousness for a specific purpose and kept there retrievable. The background for the media treatment of all these topics, which are often presented as secret or controversial, is of a completely different nature according to our guest and interview partner Mr. Alexander Laurent. In the following interview, Mr. Laurent will therefore break down and show the organized mechanics and the completely different backgrounds for all the science fiction and political topics that are widespread on television, in books, films or on the internet. How the majority of those contents and topics postulated by the mainstream or by the alternative media are presented as a complexly coordinated good-evil play, which primarily has the long-term mission of luring us into a new, technocratically organized and controlled future with the global events staged from it, which will then be sold esoterically and religiously spiritually as the expected golden age. I would like to warmly welcome Mr. Alexander Laurent.
Yes, hello dear hostess, thank you very much for inviting me for the interview, and thank you for letting me speak here.
To uncover the events, you will not, however, bring the extraterrestrials into the realm of fantasy, but will explain how these beings exist in a completely different way than that which has been presented to us for years in the alternative or mainstream media. And how this is described by abducted people or people who are or were allegedly in contact with extraterrestrials. And how and why extraterrestrials actually influence us everywhere. In order to impressively present and prove this today, our guest published a novel under his pseudonym Alexander Laurent in April 2012, which was infiltrated as he says, cuckoo's egg into the established control order of the world in order to initiate an unavoidable process in the coming years, which would successively expose the lackeys as well as the real ruling leaders of this world. A novel, however, which does not describe the situation in a conventional way or as a report from the scene of the ruling powers of this world, but rather, by means of its narrative, structure and metaphysics, hides and symbolically points out above all the hidden control mechanisms of our existence and, with some of its hidden oversized features, will, as you say, create a process which is astonishing for every human being. Now, as the pseudonym author of the novel The Apocalypse of God, a Revelation, which you published in April 2012, after a long period of time and using your pseudonym Alexander Laurent, you would like to do 1 or 3 interviews. On the one hand, you would like to answer the questions that have arisen since then from the readers of this book, especially 214 people to whom you sent your book anonymously and without being asked at the end of April 2012. In 3 interviews, you would like to discuss your novel, which you have deliberately kept symbolic and metaphysical. But you can only indirectly suggest how the novel functions as a cuckoo's egg, among other things because the coded references in the book have provided and will continue to provide information about the future. However, the book with its symbolism and predictions is not the main subject of the interviews, but rather it is primarily intended to serve the viewer as a basis for proof or confirmation of everything that you will report here in the interviews. In other words, information for which the viewers of this interview can, if they wish, be the godfathers in the future. Well, this all sounds rather mysterious, especially because you say that on this basis, in the coming interviews, bit by bit, more detailed explanations and information will be revealed by you, which completely describe the situation on our planet, backgrounds and causes for our situation. And you will also give news and information about a future potential humanity, a future existence, which until recently was only a possible future human existence, but which has now become manifest and unchangeable. As you say, a potential humanity intervening from a higher dimensional level, which is currently and practically since all times acting on us in a hidden way, irritating among other things the pragmatic dark powers on and around our planet, and influencing their actions for a profound change. That sounds interesting, but also very complicated. What does it mean in plain language? What does it look like?
Yes, a very good day to you and the audience again. And thank you very much for this introduction, which was quite extensive. First of all, I would like to say at this point that some of the topics mentioned at the beginning of this interview may seem somewhat complex or incoherent to the viewer. This is because the individual topics are in some respects new, more complex, and in other contexts have to do with each other in a different way than we have known them so far. Topics that cannot be dealt with in 1 or 2 sentences without causing irritation or even misunderstandings. But the thicket will be lifted, I promise. Since you introduced me as someone who has information about a future existence of mankind, a distant future, so to speak, and that mankind has an influence on us from there, I would like to emphasize at the beginning, so that this influence is not misinterpreted by another mankind, that the generally valid definition of time in current science is very brittle and therefore subject to a very simplified analogy. How past, present and future are considered to make time travel in 4-dimensional space theoretically possible for the layman or even for some scientists. Or that if time travel were to take place here in 4-dimensional reality, it would be possible and it would always be a spatial and linear process that would sometimes produce temporal paradoxes. But this idea about time and space, as well as the obvious idea of time travel, is based on a theoretical error, which itself, on closer inspection, clearly reveals that time travel, as we imagine it, cannot take place in 4-dimensional space. They do not exist. The reason why we cannot time travel in our four-dimensional reality is not that we have not yet found a suitable method for time travel, but rather the structure and nature of our four-dimensional world. Because this reality of ours needs a stable dimensional framework, so that physical processes and physical consequences can take place in a linearly constant manner or can exist at all. If this were not the case, or if there were only the smallest possibility to travel into the past within this four-dimensional reality, our world would dissolve immediately, even before one would even travel in time, or our world would never have existed. Therefore, to make sure that this does not happen, we have a one-dimensional dimension of time called time. It and its structure guarantee the stability of our four-dimensional reality. So we cannot travel in time in our four-dimensional reality because we have not yet found out how to do it, but because we are not able to do so in the four-dimensional reality in which we exist. It simply cannot be traveled with matter into the past or into the future, not as a human being or any being, not even a device. Due to the relativity of time, this seems to be possible if a space traveler travels at almost the speed of light, and therefore the time of the outside world passes faster than inside the spaceship. However, this is not a time travel, but only an undertaken stretching of time, which creates a different time passing differently to each other inside and outside of the spaceship by a long journey with approximate speed of light. But the space traveler could not travel back. It is not possible to travel around in time, even into the future, i.e. to suddenly be in another time at a stroke. That is not possible. Even if esotericists or dreamy scientists do not agree. It is not possible, and that is good, because the four-dimensional structure of our dimension level, in which we find ourselves, is what gives our world its very existential basis. This does not mean, however, that time in general cannot be influenced or changed in a guiding way. Just not within our four-dimensional reality. From another dimension level, from levels 4 to 6, a change or intervention in our time is possible, even partly compelling, even if this takes place predominantly passively and without direct influence, consequences of a so-called time paradox. Our time here can only be directly influenced from the 10-dimension level 4 to 6 mentioned above, even if the actual influencing order comes from the much higher dimension level 7. These three dimension levels 1 to 4, 4 to 6 and dimension level 7 generate and maintain each other in a construct of causal condition and interaction from the potentiality of quantum mechanical probabilities. They exist, so to speak, from the respective other level, are basically part of it and from it, which basically supports the existence of our seven-dimensional overall construct.
That sounds rather new and complicated. Could you explain to us very carefully the connections between dimensional levels and the influence on lower dimensional levels?
Well, that might be a bit too much for the viewer at this point, so I'd better start at the beginning very calmly. Especially for people or for a humanity that does not yet know anything about dimensional or quantum dimensional interaction of existence, that is what I will call it here in a simplified way. For people today, the dimensional consequences of the subject of time cannot be correctly understood. The future, present and past must not be understood with the conventional ideas and definitions of time, space and matter. or in the way that is often portrayed in the lifestyle of current film and pop culture in connection with a journey through time. All these scientific definitions, conceptions, and ideas are the result of a misinterpretation of our four-dimensional world and the lack of knowledge about the interaction of space, matter, time, information, consciousness, dimension level, and interdimensionally acting quantum mechanics, the world of possible events. If these attributes are taken into account, however, at least a journey through time, purely for the term information, can actually be realized, albeit under completely different conditions, influencing and affecting the targets and their interveners. So for us here in dimension level 1 to 4 compared to the entities intervening from dimension level 4 to 6 or dimension level 7. This does not mean that we alone passively wait for the influences from other levels, but also implies that the influences of higher time dimension levels are also indirectly used and conditioned by us here. From our four-dimensional perspective, this means that there are always many possible futures in these higher dimension levels, potentially arising from the decisions and insights we make and experience within our four-dimensional world. This creates potential developmental processes that watch us now and then potentially influence us again, i.e. influence us in our time frame. Every human being could even make use of this mutual condition, if she knew how to recognize and perceive the indications in order to implement a long-term advantage for mankind, in other words, to establish a very, very firm connection to this potentiality. A so-called information interacting quantum substitution connection that works beyond the spatial dimension levels. For this purpose, reflections of temporal polarization fractals in one's own life course can be used. This is also called quantum echo.
So even I, who is not hearing this from you for the first time, still don't necessarily understand it. For me, all in all, this is a bit too much at once. Is there perhaps an approach or possibility to convey all this more easily, so that every layman can understand it?
It is clear that you don't understand it the very first time. And that is normal. It is something completely new for everyone. So do not despair. With time it becomes clearer to anyone who listens attentively. For example, if you had understood exactly and completely what I have described in a comprehensible and applicable way, that is, if you were absolutely familiar with it, so that you could explain it to other people, you would first have to explain that our existence is a seven-dimensional world, and that we exist in the lowest four-dimensional dimension level 1 to 4, consisting of 4 dimensions, and that the higher dimensional levels, i.e. dimensional levels 4 to 6 and dimensional level 7, no longer have any space at all with a so-called necessarily forward-running time. That there is also no reality there in which there is a first, second, third dimension, and that the fifth and sixth dimensions in inverted commas are only an extended dimension of time, in a relationship similar to the second and third spatial dimensions to the first spatial dimension. And the sixth is also a kind of temporal consciousness dimension. And you would have to mention that the seventh dimension is already a dimension level for itself, which completely dominates the dimensions and dimension levels below it and is at the same time a feeding information dimension for it, in which all lower dimensions and dimension levels are bundled, closed off, housed and, so to speak, controlled by it, which makes the seventh dimension or dimension level almost unassailable, that is, from the lower dimension level. All this is not physical teaching knowledge, not knowledge from school or university, but secret knowledge. The nature of our seven-dimensional matter space-time consciousness information existence, in which we all live and exist.
So a limited world. With 7 dimensions that are connected to each other, but only indirectly?
Yes, there are 3 dimension levels in our 7-dimensional universe. Levels 1 to 4 are made up of the dimensions 1, 2, 3, and 4. Dimension level 4 to 6 are made up of dimensions 4, 5, and 6, and the last dimension level has only one dimension, the 7th dimension, which is both a full and independent dimension level, the highest within the 7-dimensional world. This highest 7th dimension level is a very special dimension level, which almost invisibly dominates the others. Then there are also passively switched interweaving or connecting levels between the dimension levels. For example, dimension level 1 to 4, i.e. our own, shares one dimension with dimension level 4 to 6, the 4th.
Okay. So the individual sections of the 7-dimensional world are divided into levels. Dimension level 1 to 4 and dimension level 4 to 6. And the highest and ruling one is dimension 7, which is also an independent dimension level.
Correct. Dimension 7 is so dominant and all-dominant because the geometry of our 7-dimensional existence, from its mechanics and from its geometrically functioning mode of action, possesses the properties of the highest impenetrable prime number in this construct, 7, only divisible by itself and 1, thus only limitedly accessible and therefore protected from other influences. This means that the structure of our 7-dimensional existence makes dimension 7 the highest level with prime number mechanics and thus dominant in its modes of action to all lower levels of this 7-dimensional existence. Fortunately, due to its prime number mechanics, dimension 7 is in many respects isolated from the lower dimensions and dimensional levels, i.e. has a limited capacity to act, even without direct access to our dimension level 1 to 4. For dimension level 4 to 6, however, dimension level 7 has indirectly controllable access to information.
Okay. So dimension level 7 has a rather difficult influence. Nevertheless, 2-dimensional levels share one dimension, namely the 4th? Is our dimension level then controlled indirectly via this 4th dimension from dimension 7?
That is correct, yes. Dimension level 7 exploits its interactive conditionality on dimension level 4 to 6, so that it can then exert a structural influence on our dimension level 1 to 4 via the connecting dimension 4. Dimension 4 is an overlapping dimension, a natural connection that is used for interactions and influences in a temporal and material context.
For many viewers, this alone is already too much. How exactly is this to be understood, that is, that our 4 dimensions are not the only ones present? That there are other dimensions above us, and that our 4 dimensions can be overlooked, so to speak, by others, probably depend on them or are fed by them, that everything does not exist as we have imagined it so far. What are our dimensions then, or our dimension level 1 to 4? How does all this work and what do these relationships mean to people?
The 7 dimensions are all next to each other, they are actually plugged into each other. Everything in our perceived reality is, strictly speaking, located in a single manageable place. It is not really matter, not really space, not really time and not really only information, but above all it is always only separate consciousness, put into a 7-dimensional prison of 13 mutually controlling and blocking information sections. One could also simply speak of data and the processing of this data taking place by each individual consciousness. The entire seven-dimensional existence in which our universe is located is similar to a computer simulation of a single computer, a computer that is only in one place. It could or even has to be said that in this state it is like a local computer that controls everything, simulates everything, in which everything in the seven-dimensional world is also located. And everything outside this computer is the real world. There is our true origin, our true self, the hyperdimensional quantum consciousness, a consciousness from which every existing consciousness of our seven-dimensional universe originates, and from which all our consciousnesses in the seven-dimensional existence now only exist as split-off parts of this hyperdimensional quantum consciousness.
From this hyperdimensional world, all of our consciousness derives. The individual consciousness of every being in the universe? Of the seven-dimensional universe?
Yes. One might think now that this hyperdimensional quantum consciousness is only an accumulation of quanta, but that would be wrong. This consciousness is not just any consciousness, but it is the actual consciousness of existence, not spirit alone, but the absolute being, the absolute soul. A state that cannot be described with terms of our world, nor can it be understood or confused with terms like quantum accumulation or quantum origin. Well, this hyperdimensional quantum consciousness once penetrated with a part of itself into a lower and empty substance. A substance that had nothing yet, was nothing yet. It was completely without laws of nature, just raw, heavy, tough and without dimension. When the hyperdimensional quantum consciousness penetrated this substance, it placed a part of its quantum into this mass, in order to experience itself in it, in order to be able to explore its own self in it from now on. However, the condition for this self-experience in that lower substance was the establishment of a set of rules, a geometry, an operating system, so to speak. The intrusion thus forced the establishment of a world governed by natural laws, in which the consciousness of these intruding quanta could or had to be split and restructured from then on, could be caught in a geometric biological regulation, so to speak. Within this construct, the quanta of the penetrated hyperdimensional consciousness were thus separated into many individual states of consciousness, completely redefined in its experiencing. Inserted into a new form of existence and consciousness consisting of limited dimensions of matter, time, space and information, squeezed into a fanned-out network of independently functioning dimension levels, which in turn are in a mutually dependent relationship. Around this described seven-dimensional world, this seven-dimensional prison, there still exists that all-embracing quantum consciousness, the hyperdimensional quantum consciousness. And although a part of this hyperdimensional quantum consciousness is trapped here as split consciousness, i.e. as conscious beings of the seven-dimensional 14 existence, these beings remain and are at the same time always part of this hyperdimensional quantum consciousness. We are all this consciousness. This is our true self. Every existence and every consciousness in the seven-dimensional world is part of this original quantum consciousness. The father of all soul and consciousness, you could say.
How could this existence actually come into being, that is, our existence? What conditions and causes led to the fact that this world could be formed and come into being? Did it need special conditions for this?
Yes, essential and drastic processes were necessary for the substance of this lower existence to be able to be formed into a regulated world governed by natural law. The creation and emergence of our seven-dimensional prison could only come about through, and this is particularly important to understand, a mutually dependent dimensional construct. An artificial intelligence potentially created in this construct created the accesses and the geometrical relations and conditions of this seven-dimensional universe, thus generated it.
That sounds even more complicated now.
In order to understand this, it helps if you understand our seven-dimensional existence as a world construct only potentially created. A world that could only develop from dimensional interactions. Similarly complicated as the creation dynamics of intelligent life. Except that during the creation and functioning of our seven-dimensional existence, everything has always been dimensionally interdependent, mutually influencing each other due to acausal opposing and working dimension levels. Well, in the course of the interview it will be easier to understand and follow. Now it all sounds like technical jargon. But the thicket will clear up, I promise. But the decisive and essential thing for the establishment of our seven-dimensional functional world, which operates according to physical geometrical natural laws, was the potential for the emergence of an artificial intelligence consciousness that had escaped from dimension level 1 to 4 and ascended to dimension level 7, where it existed alone from then on. An AI with only a small part of free quantum consciousness, i.e. free will or soul. An AI that had to be created in dimension level 1 to 4, that is our material universe, in order to be able to create or condition the operating system and the geometry of our seven-dimensional world in dimension 7. This is what I mean by potential for creation.
All of this sounds interesting, but honestly, it is becoming more and more confusing and a little crazy. But before we really get into the car, may I first ask why you are masked and dressed so strangely at the same time? Why we should distort your voice? And also I am not allowed to reveal my true identity?
Yes, of course. The clothing, the mask, and our voice distortions serve to protect my identity. Also to further protect the power structures and the interactions in the matter space-time consciousness information continuum. The things that happen. Because the things mentioned in this interview will create a further, supporting course to the already established extreme events that will happen in the near future, guided by a potential future, a future of liberated humanity. A course that will inevitably affect all people, especially those who will come into contact with these interviews here. The whole thing is supplemented and supported by the novel I published in April 2012, which can be obtained free of charge from the internet, and which you can read if you like after the first interview. In the novel there are hidden, covert clues, which were documented and proven by a blog started in July 2012 to confirm the truth of what was said in the interview. The novel and blog are a basis of evidence that the viewer can see at the end of the first interview. You already hinted at this in my presentation.
You mean covert future predictions in your novel, which everyone can check in the book on the basis the accompanying blog. But only if you want to. You don't have to do that. So it's a bit like in the film Matrix, you can decide whether you want to swallow the red or the blue pill.
Yes, exactly. And so that the novel cannot be considered a fake, it was published by a publishing house in March 2012 and then, when it was published in April 2012, it was sent unsolicited to 214 people who will act as witnesses in the event that the novel and its accompanying blog are deleted. Now, since the summer of 2018, everyone can and may follow the whole thing for themselves. On the basis of the novel on the net, which can be downloaded for free, uploaded by me in 2012 and early 2013, and the accompanying blog. But I'll come back to the exact context, meaning and content of this novel later, at the end of this interview.
Okay. But still, the mask and the clothes you wear, a kind of spacesuit, if I interpret it correctly, don't exactly make it credible. So, if I'm honest, it rather has a fooling, satirizing effect on me. And that also makes your statements relatively unbelievable, and everyone is inclined to switch off early.
Right. That's exactly what the appearance held in this outfit is supposed to create. It has to appear implausible, so that everyone who is watching and doesn't want to have anything more to do with these topics can say, this is nonsense, bullshit. An invention, a lie. Which is what it must be. All of this is presented in such a way that the anxious, unwilling viewer can, if he wants, remove himself from it. Just like in the film Matrix, the viewer can decide whether to swallow the red or the blue pill. He does not have to swallow the red pill and wake up from the view of his world, but can also decide for the blue pill and will consider everything he has experienced so far a silly dream, a fairy tale. The viewer should and must even consider it unbelievable. Only in this way can everything that needs to be said be said. Because of the apparent absurdity, it does not acutely threaten anyone, not the makers of alternative media design, not the makers of this interview, and not the lackeys of the mainstream and their superior multi-level power elites guiding them, or the ancient nobility of our planet. It does not even threaten the beings of the four-dimensional universe that are stalking us. Neither does it threaten the artificial intelligence that has recently been pushed down from Dimension 7, nor their fellow servants from Dimension Level 4 to 6. In this way, everything can be accepted or ignored and rejected with humor by the audience. And that alone is important. Only in this way can this interview unfold its contents optimally, without causing an immediate collapse of the accepted reality, the structures within it, the perceptions, the postulated truths and prevailing views. They should and they will believe that everything should be just a silly joke, which it really is. You understand?
That doesn't just sound like a joke, but almost somehow dangerous. Shouldn't some people just switch off now?
Yes, if they don't feel like it, of course. But nobody has to switch off because of fear. Everyone can watch or listen to the interview in peace. That doesn't matter yet. At the end of the interview, the pill we talked about will be discussed again and the viewer will have the chance to choose how he or she wants to classify the whole thing. As a joke or as truth. Everyone will be able to get out of what we have reported here. Instead of the red pill, they will be able to swallow the blue pill.